I stood in the freezing rain clutching my 6-year-old son tightly against my chest, watching my older brother toss our entire lives onto the wet grass in cheap cardboard boxes. Just 3 weeks after our parents died, he waved a legal document in my face, claiming the family estate was entirely his, and mocking me for quitting my job. His wife stood on the porch in her designer silk robe laughing as she told me to find a cleaning job instead of leeching off my brother's inheritance. They thought I was a broke, unemployed single mother with absolutely nowhere to go. They had no idea I had just sold my tech company, and that within days I would own the exact debt that held his fake, pathetic life together. Before I tell you how I legally destroyed my brother and left him begging on his knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. My name is Claire. I am 34 years old and family has always been a toxic word in my vocabulary. It was 11 at night, and the rain in Chicago was coming down in thick freezing sheets. My son Leo was trembling beside me, his small fingers gripping the hem of my jacket. We were standing on the manicured front lawn of the house I grew up in, the house that had belonged to my parents, Thomas and Martha. Just 3 weeks ago, we buried them. Now their beloved golden child was erasing my existence from this property with zero hesitation. Bradley. My 38-year-old brother marched out the heavy oak front door, carrying another cardboard box. He did not even bother to tape it shut. He hurled it off the porch with a violent shove. The box hit the muddy grass, bursting open and scattering Leo's favorite toys and my winter clothes into the freezing puddles. Bradley stood at the top of the stairs, shielded from the rain by the massive portico, looking down at us with a sneer of absolute disgust. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his tailored suit jacket and waved it in the air like a weapon. He shouted over the sound of the rain that he had a power of attorney. He claimed our parents had signed it right before they passed, giving him total control over the estate and every single asset they left behind. He told me the house was his now. He said I had overstayed my welcome and that he was done subsidizing my lazy lifestyle. I stared at him, feeling the icy water soak through my shoes, but my mind was sharp. Bradley had always been the golden child of this family. He was the brilliant hedge fund manager, the son who could do no wrong, the one who bragged about his massive financial bonuses at every holiday. Our parents worshipped him. Meanwhile, they constantly criticized every move I made. When I told them I was resigning from my corporate job a few months ago, they called me a disgrace. Bradley had laughed and told them I was just a failure who could not handle real pressure. He used that false narrative tonight to justify throwing a grieving mother and child onto the street. "You are a grown woman, Claire," Bradley yelled, his voice cutting fiercely through the storm. "You quit a perfectly good job because you are lazy. You expect mom and dad to just house you forever. Well, they are gone. And I am not running a charity for unemployed dropouts. Pack up your garbage and get off my property before I call the police." I pulled Leo closer to my side, shielding him from the bitter wind. I did not raise my voice or scream. I simply asked him how he could do this to his own nephew just 3 weeks after the funeral. I asked him if this was what our parents would have wanted, kicking a 6-year-old boy out into a dangerous winter storm. Bradley laughed. It was a sharp, cruel sound that made my blood boil. He said our parents wanted their legacy protected by someone successful, not drained by a parasite. He told me I was nothing but a burden. That was when Jasmine stepped out onto the porch. She was Bradley's wife, a 35-year-old African-American woman who prided herself on projecting extreme wealth and social status. She was wearing a $1,000 designer silk robe, completely untouched by the rain, holding a crystal glass of red wine. Jasmine had always hated me. She resented the fact that our parents had ever spent a dime on my education, viewing every dollar given to me as a dollar stolen from her lavish lifestyle. She looked down at the soaked boxes on the lawn and then looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Her lips curled into a nasty, condescending smirk. "You really should take your kid and go find a cleaning job instead of leeching off my husband's inheritance," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with venom. Maybe if you actually worked hard instead of quitting the minute things got tough, you would not be standing in the mud right now looking pathetic. We have important guests coming this weekend, Claire. We cannot have a broke relative squatting in the guest wing. It ruins the aesthetic of the entire estate. The sheer audacity of her words hung heavily in the air. She was standing in my childhood home sipping expensive wine, telling me I ruined the aesthetic of the house my parents built. Bradley wrapped his arm around Jasmine's waist, nodding in complete agreement. They stood there together waiting for me to break. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to beg. They wanted the twisted satisfaction of watching me fall apart so they could feel superior and powerful. But I did not cry. The freezing rain washed over my face, but a burning white-hot clarity took over my entire body. I looked at the power of attorney document still clutched in Bradley's hand. I knew exactly what kind of man my brother was. I knew his greed, his arrogance, and his desperate need to project a flawless image to the world. And I knew that his entire life was a fragile house of cards waiting to be knocked down. I crouched down and lifted Leo into my arms. My son buried his face in my neck, shivering violently from the cold. I stood back up and locked eyes with Bradley. I did not beg. I did not shed a single tear. I just stared dead into his eyes with a coldness that made his smug smirk falter for a fraction of a second. "You are going to regret tonight, Bradley," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, cutting right through the heavy rain. "You both are going to regret every single word you just said to me." Jasmine rolled her eyes and took a slow sip of her wine. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "What are you going to do, Claire? Leave a bad review on the internet. Get off our lawn before you track mud on the driveway." Bradley did not say anything else. He just glared at me, turned his back, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The lock clicked loudly, echoing in the damp night air. The porch lights immediately flicked off, plunging the front yard into total darkness. They had literally left us in the dark. I stood alone in the rain with my son shivering in my arms and our belongings ruined in the mud. Any other person might have broken down right there. But I just pulled my phone from my pocket. I wiped the raindrops from the screen and opened the app to order an Uber. I did not look back at the house. I did not need to. My brother and his wife thought they had just disposed of the family failure. They thought they had secured their wealth and eliminated the only complication in their perfect, greedy lives. They had absolutely no idea who they had just thrown out into the storm. The black sedan pulled up to the curb, its headlights slicing through the torrential downpour. I hurried Leo into the warm back seat, shielding his small body from the freezing rain before climbing in beside him. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, glanced at us through the rearview mirror. He saw a drenched, shivering mother and her young son, clearly kicked out of a wealthy suburban neighborhood in the middle of the night. He cleared his throat softly, turning down the radio. He offered to take us to a cheap budget motel just off the interstate, saying it was clean if we needed a place to stay. I gently dried Leo's hair with a towel from my bag. Meeting the driver's sympathetic gaze in the mirror, I politely declined his offer and told him to take us to the Azure Tower in downtown Chicago. The driver blinked in sheer surprise. The Azure Tower was the most exclusive hyper-luxury high-rise in the entire city. It was a fortress built for billionaire executives, international diplomats, and elite entrepreneurs. It was not a place you went to unless you practically owned the sky. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, likely wondering how a woman thrown out into the mud could afford to even breathe the air in that zip code. He simply nodded and pulled the car onto the main road. As the vehicle sped toward the glowing skyline of the city, I held Leo close until his shivering stopped and his breathing deepened into a steady rhythm of sleep. Watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked window, my mind drifted briefly to the day we buried our parents. Bradley had cornered me near the floral arrangements, leaning in close, so only I could hear him. He whispered with a vicious sneer that I was a jobless loser who brought nothing but absolute shame to the family name. I had simply nodded and walked away from him that afternoon. He believed I was unemployed because I had formally resigned from my corporate job 2 months prior. What my arrogant brother and his status-obsessed wife did not know was the exact reason behind my sudden resignation. I had not quit because I was lazy or unable to handle the pressure of the corporate world. I had stepped down because I had just finalized the monumental sale of my very own company. For the past 6 years, working late into the night after putting Leo to bed, I had built a highly sophisticated fintech data analytics platform from scratch. When a massive global tech conglomerate offered to buy me out, I negotiated a ruthless ironclad exit strategy. I kept the entire deal a complete secret from my family. I knew exactly how they operated. If my parents or Bradley had known about the buyout, they would have immediately demanded a massive share, claiming they deserved it for raising me. They would have manipulated the narrative, diminished my hard work, and used my money to fund Jasmine's endless shopping sprees or Bradley's flashy lifestyle. So I stayed silent. I let them think I was a struggling single mother who could not hold down a real job. The sedan glided to a smooth halt under the brilliantly lit awning of the Azure Tower. Two uniformed doormen immediately rushed forward with large umbrellas. They did not look at my wet clothes or my muddy shoes with disdain. Instead, they opened the doors with absolute reverence. The head concierge bowed his head slightly as he helped me lift a sleeping Leo from the back seat, welcoming me home and asking if the staff should prepare a warm meal for us. I requested some hot tea sent up to the penthouse and handed the driver a $100 bill as a tip. I carried my son across the pristine marble floor of the grand lobby and stepped into the private biometric-secured elevator. The doors glided shut, instantly shutting out the violent storm and the chaos of the night. The elevator shot upward in total silence, ascending directly to the 40th floor. The doors opened directly into my home, a massive glass-walled penthouse offering a panoramic, breathtaking view of the glittering Chicago skyline. I walked straight to Leo's bedroom, a sprawling space decorated with hand-painted murals of the solar system. I gently changed him into warm, dry pajamas and tucked him under his heavy down comforter. He curled into the plush pillows, perfectly safe, completely unaware of the toxic drama we had just escaped. I kissed his forehead and stepped out of the room. Walking into my massive kitchen, I poured a glass of cold water and leaned against the dark granite island. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Bradley and Jasmine was finally beginning to settle, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a high-priority notification. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an encrypted message from my primary banking institution confirming that the final tranches of the corporate buyout had cleared the escrow accounts and were securely deposited. I opened the banking application and authenticated my login with my fingerprint. The screen loaded in a fraction of a second. The bold green numbers stared back at me in the dim light of the luxury penthouse. Available balance: $65,420,000. I stared at the staggering 8-figure sum. Bradley had kicked me out into the freezing rain over a house worth maybe $2 million, completely blind to the fact that I could buy his entire investment firm in cash without even blinking. He had threatened me, mocked me, and tried to strip away my dignity because he truly thought I was defenseless. He thought his perceived financial superiority gave him the absolute right to be a tyrant. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the glowing city streets far below. Bradley was a hedge fund manager, a man like that obsessed with flashy cars, elite country clubs, and maintaining an illusion of ultimate power rarely played by the rules. Jasmine's extreme spending habits alone were a massive red flag. I knew the signs of financial overcompensation. People who flaunt their wealth the loudest are usually hiding the deepest, most dangerous debts. Bradley was hiding something massive, and I was going to find it. I picked up my phone again and bypassed my regular contacts, opening a highly secure line. I dialed the direct number for my private wealth management and elite corporate investigation team. The line rang twice before a sharp, hyper-professional voice answered the call. "Good evening, Claire," my lead investigator said, completely unfazed by the late hour. "What do you need?" "I need a complete, absolute financial autopsy on my brother Bradley," I instructed, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "I want to know every single transaction he has made in the last 5 years. I want to see the balance sheets of his investment fund, his personal credit lines, his offshore accounts, and every single debt his wife Jasmine has incurred. Dig into his clients, his losses, and his corporate audits. He is hiding something fatal, and I want the indisputable proof sitting on my desk before the sun comes up. The hunt for Bradley's financial skeletons had officially begun. 2 days later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The violent storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky over the Chicago skyline. I sat at my massive oak dining table, sipping a fresh espresso while reviewing the preliminary data my investigation team had already started compiling. My son Leo was happily engaged with his new private tutor in the adjacent playroom, completely oblivious to the war I was preparing to wage against my own blood. I was just about to dive into a massive spreadsheet of offshore wire transfers when my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. The caller ID displayed Jasmine's name. I stared at the screen, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. I knew exactly what this was. Bradley and Jasmine were trying to tie up loose ends before the official reading of our parents' will. They wanted to ensure I was completely neutralized before any legal documents could be opened. I tapped the screen to accept the call and brought the phone to my ear, remaining absolutely silent. "Claire, is that you?" Jasmine's voice echoed through the speaker, artificially sweet and dripping with false concern. The unmistakable clinking of silverware against fine china and the low murmur of overlapping voices drifted through the background. She had me on speakerphone. She was hosting the traditional Sunday family brunch, surrounded by aunts, uncles, and cousins who had always eagerly consumed my family's toxic drama. She wanted an audience to witness her ultimate triumph over the destitute, unemployed sister-in-law. "Yes, Jasmine, I am here," I replied, my tone flat and utterly bored. "Oh, good. I was so worried about you and little Leo," she cooed loudly, ensuring every relative in her dining room could hear her performance. "Bradley and I have just been sick with worry since you stormed off the other night. We know things are incredibly tight for you right now, especially since you are still refusing to find a real job. We cannot bear the thought of my nephew going hungry just because his mother is too stubborn to ask for help." I leaned back in my leather chair, taking another sip of espresso. I did not storm off, Jasmine. I ordered an Uber because my brother threw my child's belongings into the mud. Jasmine let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. "See, this is exactly the kind of delusional defensive attitude that makes it so hard to help you. But we are family, and Bradley is just too generous for his own good. He wants to help you get back on your feet. He is willing to write you a check right now for $1,000. You can use it to buy some cheap groceries and maybe put a deposit down on a small, affordable apartment in a low-income neighborhood." I remained dead silent, letting her hang herself with her own words. "Of course, there is just one tiny formality," Jasmine continued, her voice taking on a sharp, businesslike edge. "Since Bradley is already acting as the sole executor, it just makes sense to streamline the legal process. The lawyer needs a simple waiver signed. It basically just says you agree to skip the official will reading tomorrow and forfeit any baseless claims against the estate. It is just a piece of paper, Claire. Sign it, and the $1,000 is yours. Think of Leo. You desperately need this money." I could practically hear the relatives nodding along in the background, marveling at Jasmine's manufactured grace and charity. They thought she was a saint for throwing pennies at the family failure. They thought I was sitting in some damp motel room weeping with gratitude. Instead, I opened the digital dossier my lead investigator had sent me just an hour ago. It contained the real-time financial tracking of Jasmine's personal accounts. I scanned the highlighted red columns, my eyes locking onto a treasure trove of financial humiliation. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "I am looking at a screen right now, Jasmine," I said, my voice echoing coldly through her speakerphone. "And it tells a very different story about who desperately needs money." "What are you talking about?" She snapped, her artificial sweetness immediately cracking. "I am talking about your Platinum Elite credit card," I stated, speaking loudly and clearly, so every single relative at that brunch table would hear every syllable. The one ending in 4291. "It seems you tried to buy a vintage Chanel handbag 2 days ago at the boutique on Oak Street." The transaction was for $8,500. It was declined for insufficient funds. The background chatter at the family brunch instantly died. Total suffocating silence fell over Jasmine's dining room. "You are lying!" Jasmine shrieked, panic suddenly bleeding into her voice. "Shut up!" I did not stop. I read from the next line of the dossier. "Then there is the lease agreement for your white Range Rover. You are currently 3 months behind on payments. The dealership issued a final warning of repossession last Tuesday. And let us not forget the country club membership fees. Bradley's corporate card was flagged for a fraudulent charge attempt when he tried to cover your outstanding balance of $14,000. It seems your husband's massive hedge fund bonuses are completely fictional." A collective audible gasp erupted from the relatives in the background. I could hear an aunt whispering furiously to an uncle. The illusion of Jasmine's untouchable wealth was being violently ripped apart in front of the exact people she was trying to impress. "Turn the speaker off!" Jasmine screamed at someone in the room, her voice pitching into absolute hysteria. "Turn it off right now. You do not have $1,000 to give me, Jasmine?" I continued, my tone dripping with icy authority. "You are drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, on maxed-out credit cards, desperately trying to fake a lifestyle you cannot afford. You want me to sign away my rights because you and Bradley are completely broke, and you need my parents' estate to save yourselves from total financial ruin. You are a psycho!" Jasmine roared, the sound of glass shattering echoing through the phone as she likely knocked something off her pristine dining table. "You are a jealous, unemployed loser, and my husband is going to make sure you rot in the streets. I think you should check your own bank accounts before you worry about mine," I replied. "Tell Bradley I will see him at the law office tomorrow. Do not be late." I ended the call, cutting off her frantic screaming. I set the phone down on the granite island, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over me. The flying monkeys in my family had just witnessed the cracks in the golden child's armor. Jasmine's perfect, wealthy aesthetic had been publicly decimated. Just as I took another sip of my espresso, my secure laptop chimed with a high-priority encrypted email notification. It was from my lead investigator. The subject line glowed boldly against the dark screen of my monitor. "Bradley's Investment Fund. Classified." I clicked open the attached PDF file. The first page contained a summary report of his corporate transactions over the last 12 months. My eyes scanned the staggering numbers, moving past the fake profit margins and diving straight into the hidden ledgers. What I saw made my blood run cold, followed immediately by a sharp thrill of impending victory. Bradley had not just made a few bad investments, he had committed federal crimes. The absolute weapon I needed to destroy him was sitting right in front of me. I did not waste a single second. I immediately summoned my lead financial investigator Victor and his forensic accounting team to my penthouse. Within 45 minutes, 3 sharp-looking professionals in tailored suits walked through my private elevator doors, carrying encrypted briefcases and secure servers. I directed them to the massive smart glass wall in my home office, a transparent digital display that overlooked the glowing Chicago skyline. Victor connected his drive, and the glass wall instantly illuminated with complex flowcharts, wire transfer logs, and offshore corporate structures. The red lines on the graph all traced back to one single entity, Bradley's supposedly elite hedge fund. Victor stood before the glowing screen and laid out the exact anatomy of my brother's financial crimes. Bradley was not a genius investor. He was a desperate gambler wearing a Rolex. Over the past 14 months, he had systematically siphoned exactly $5 million from his top-tier clients. He had funneled the stolen capital through a series of shell companies based in the Cayman Islands, using fake consulting fees to mask the massive illegal withdrawals. I asked Victor where the money actually went, refusing to believe my arrogant brother was smart enough to hide it perfectly. Victor tapped a key on his tablet, bringing up a horrifying cascade of digital receipts. Bradley had blown the entire $5 million on a catastrophic combination of highly leveraged cryptocurrency crashes and high-stakes offshore gambling syndicates. He was attempting to cover his initial market losses by betting client money on volatile digital assets. When those unregulated markets tanked, he panicked. He turned to illegal sports betting networks, hoping for a miraculous payout to replace the missing corporate funds. He lost every single cent. The data trail was absolute and legally damning. The sheer stupidity of his actions left me momentarily speechless. Bradley, the golden child who constantly lectured me about personal responsibility, had committed federal wire fraud and embezzlement. Victor then highlighted a flashing red date on the timeline projected on the glass. He explained the trap Bradley was currently caught in. His investment firm was scheduled for a mandatory comprehensive quarterly audit by an external regulatory board in exactly 7 days. The second those auditors looked at the raw data, Bradley would be exposed, arrested, and facing decades in federal prison. I stared at the timeline, the pieces of my brother's cruel behavior from the other night finally snapping into perfect clarity. He did not kick me out just because he hated me. He kicked me out because he was a trapped animal operating on pure desperation. His master plan was sickeningly clear. Our parents' estate, including the massive suburban house and their liquid assets, was valued at roughly $2 million. Bradley needed absolute uncontested control of that inheritance immediately. His goal was to inherit the estate today, take out an aggressive high-interest commercial mortgage against the property by tomorrow, and use that cash to partially plug the massive $5 million hole in his client accounts before the auditors arrived next week. He figured he could fake the rest of the ledger if he just had enough liquid cash to pass the initial compliance checks. He was willing to throw his own sister and a 6-year-old child into the freezing rain just to save himself from a federal prison sentence. But as I scrutinized the dates of Bradley's frantic wire transfers, a specific detail caught my eye. The largest chunk of embezzled money had been moved exactly 1 month before my parents died. I cross-referenced that date with my own memory. It was the exact same afternoon my father Thomas had driven downtown to unexpectedly visit Bradley at his corporate office. I remembered my father returning home that evening, looking completely ashen, his hands shaking as he locked himself in his study. He had refused to eat dinner and snapped at my mother when she asked what was wrong. A cold realization washed over me. My father knew. Thomas had discovered the embezzlement. He knew his golden child was a complete fraud and a desperate criminal. The stress of that dark discovery, the horrifying realization that his son was facing federal prison and public disgrace, must have contributed to the sudden fatal decline in his health. My father had taken that dark, shameful secret to his grave, but not before leaving a final set of legal instructions that I was only just beginning to understand. I dismissed Victor and his team just as the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant orange glow across my penthouse. The financial autopsy was complete. I had the smoking gun loaded and ready. The official will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock this morning at the downtown offices of Mr. Harrison, our family's longtime estate lawyer. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet, moving right past the rows of custom designer suits and expensive silk dresses. I was not going to walk into that law office looking like a multi-million-dollar tech founder. I needed them to believe their own delusional narrative right up until the very last second. I pulled out the exact same clothes I had worn the night Bradley evicted me. A simple, slightly faded wool sweater, plain dark jeans, and a pair of scuffed boots. I tied my hair back into a messy knot. I looked exactly like the defeated, unemployed single mother they all believed me to be. I kissed Leo goodbye, leaving him in the care of his private nanny, with strict instructions to have his favorite lunch ready when I returned. I stepped into the private elevator and headed down to the lobby. I did not take one of my luxury vehicles. Instead, I hailed a standard, unremarkable yellow cab to take me across the city. As the cab navigated the busy morning traffic, I felt my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic calm. There was no fear left inside me, no grief for the family I never really had. There was only the cold, mechanical precision of a woman walking into a trap she had already dismantled. I was preparing to walk directly into the lion's den, fully aware that I was the deadliest thing inside it. The yellow cab pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass and steel structure of the Harrison and Associates law firm. I handed the driver a crumpled $20 bill, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and pulled my faded wool sweater tighter around my shoulders. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the chaotic noise of the downtown traffic wash over me. I walked through the massive revolving doors and stepped into the sprawling, immaculate marble lobby. The stark contrast between my scuffed boots and the highly polished floors drew a fleeting glance from the security guard at the front desk. I ignored him, staring straight ahead as I approached the elevators. I pressed the button for the 52nd floor, feeling the familiar mechanical hum of the building carrying me upward toward the final battleground. When the silver elevator doors glided open, I stepped onto the thick, expensive carpet of the firm's reception area. Before I could even approach the main desk to announce my arrival, two figures stepped out from an adjacent hallway, deliberately moving to intercept me. Bradley and Jasmine were standing side by side, forming a physical barricade directly in front of the heavy, dark mahogany doors that led to Mr. Harrison's private conference room. They had clearly been waiting out here specifically to ambush me before any legal proceedings could begin. My brother was wearing a dark, custom-tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than the average car. His hair was slicked back flawlessly, and a heavy gold watch gleamed on his wrist. But despite his aggressive posture, I could see the faint sheen of sweat gathering at his temples. He was nervous. Beneath the expensive fabric and the arrogant stance, he was a desperate criminal silently panicking about his impending audit. Jasmine stood next to him, radiating pure, unadulterated hostility. She was wearing a perfectly fitted emerald green designer dress, clutching a rare leather handbag that I now knew was purchased on borrowed time and maxed out credit lines. She looked me up and down, taking in my messy hair and my plain jeans with an expression of absolute disgust. "You actually showed up," Jasmine sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "We genuinely thought you would be too ashamed to show your face here after the pathetic temper tantrum you threw the other night. You look like you just crawled out of a dumpster, Claire. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for us to be associated with someone who refuses to even try?" I kept my expression completely blank. I did not engage with her insults. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked past her, fixing my gaze directly on my brother. "Move out of the way, Bradley," I said, my voice steady and dangerously quiet. "I am here for the reading, and we are already running late." Bradley did not budge. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest to make himself look more imposing. He let out a harsh, patronizing laugh that echoed in the quiet reception area. "You are not going into that room," Claire Bradley stated, his tone carrying the absolute arrogance of a man who believed he held all the power. "You are not going to sit at that table, and you are not going to embarrass the family name anymore. I am the sole executor of the estate. Dad put me in charge because he knew you were a complete failure. You bring absolutely nothing to the table, and there is no reason for you to be present for grown-up business." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He clicked a silver pen and began writing, pressing down hard on the paper. I watched his hand move, noting the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his fingers. He tore the check from the binding with a sharp rip and held it out toward me. $10,000, Bradley said, thrusting the paper closer to my chest. "Take it. This is more money than you have seen in a year. Take the money, turn around, get back in the elevator, and disappear. You can use it to pay off whatever massive debts you have accumulated since you threw your career away. Consider it a final act of charity from your big brother." I looked at the piece of paper fluttering in his hand. $10,000. It was a pathetic, insulting bribe. It was also a massive red flag. A man secure in his inheritance does not try to buy off a beneficiary in the hallway before a will reading. He was terrified of what might happen if I sat down at that table. I did not reach for the check. I kept my hands firmly in my pockets. "I am not taking your money, Bradley," I replied smoothly. "Put it away and step aside." Bradley's face darkened. The false patronizing charm vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious, cornered fury. He snatched the check back, crushing it slightly in his fist as he leaned down to invade my personal space. "You really want to play hardball with me, Claire?" he growled, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. "You think you have any leverage here? You are a jobless single mother living off handouts. If you do not turn around and walk away right now, I will not just cut you out of the estate. I will completely destroy your life. Jasmine stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with malicious excitement. Listen to him, Claire. Jasmine chimed in, her tone sharp and threatening. You do not want to test us. We have the best lawyers in the city on retainer. We can make things very, very difficult for you. Bradley pointed his silver pen directly at my face. If you open that door, I am going to have my legal team file an emergency petition regarding your son. I will call Child Protective Services this afternoon. I will tell them exactly what you are. An unfit, unemployed, financially unstable mother who cannot even provide a stable roof over her child's head. You were standing out in a freezing storm just days ago. How do you think a judge will view that? He smiled, a dark, twisted expression that made my stomach churn with disgust. I will use my wealth and my standing in the community to prove you are a danger to Leo Bradley, threatened, his voice dripping with malice. I will tie you up in family court until you are completely bankrupt. I will have your son taken away and placed in foster care, or maybe I will just take custody of him myself so he actually has a decent future. You will never see him again. Take the check, Claire. Walk away or lose your son. The choice is yours. Jasmine let out a soft, victorious smirk, crossing her arms again. She looked at me as if I had already been defeated, convinced that the threat of losing my child had broken my spirit. They truly believed they had played the ultimate trump card. They thought the mere mention of taking Leo away would send me running in tears. I did not step back. I did not flinch. Instead, I pulled my hands out of my pockets and stepped directly into Bradley's personal space, closing the distance between us until we were merely inches apart. I looked up into his eyes, refusing to take the crumpled check. You really think you can threaten me with my own child, Bradley? I kept my voice eerily steady, refusing to raise it a single decibel. The air in the reception area felt suddenly heavy, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a massive explosion. Bradley stood there clutching his pathetic check, waiting for me to break down into tears and surrender. Instead, I gave him a smile that held absolutely zero warmth. I told him that if he wanted to play a game of legal warfare, we were going to play it strictly by my rules. I started dissecting his threat piece by piece, speaking with the cold precision of a surgeon operating on a fatal wound. I informed him that under the State Family Court Act, specifically Section 302, removing a child from their primary caregiver requires demonstrable physical proof of severe neglect, active physical abuse, or a living environment that poses an imminent life-threatening danger to the minor. I reminded him that standing in the rain after an illegal undocumented eviction initiated by a hostile family member does not constitute child endangerment in any court of law. In fact, it constitutes a self-help eviction, which is a direct violation of state property laws. I told him I could easily have him charged with a misdemeanor for that stunt alone, which would look fantastic on his flawless corporate record. I further explained that child protective investigators do not simply take the word of a bitter relative. They conduct surprise home visits, interview teachers, pediatricians, and neighbors. They look for a verified history of stability, which I possess in absolute abundance. I warned him that launching a malicious investigation is a two-way street. The moment he opens that door, his own life becomes subject to the exact same grueling scrutiny. I asked him how his pristine corporate image would survive state agents walking into his glass office to interview his wealthy clients about his fitness as a legal guardian. I then shifted my gaze to the man standing just behind Bradley's right shoulder. He was a sharp-suited attorney clutching a leather briefcase, clearly hired by my brother to intimidate me into submission. I looked the man dead in the eye and asked him directly if he planned to submit a formal petition based on entirely fabricated claims provided by a malicious relative. I reminded this high-paid lawyer of Rule 3.1 of the Professional Rules of Conduct, stating that a lawyer shall not bring or defend a proceeding unless there is a clear basis in law and fact. Filing a false malicious child endangerment report with the state could result in immediate judicial sanctions, severe financial penalties, and a very swift, incredibly unpleasant review by the State Ethics Board. The lawyer's face instantly drained of color. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his silk tie. He shifted his weight from side to side, suddenly realizing that the woman standing before him was not some uneducated, unemployed victim he could easily bully. He frantically opened his leather briefcase and shoved his documents inside, wanting absolutely no part in a case that was rapidly spiraling out of control. His hourly rate was nowhere near high enough to justify losing his law license over Bradley's arrogant mistakes. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, physically isolating himself from the man paying his bills entirely, surrendering the battlefield to me. I turned my undivided attention back to my brother. I told Bradley that if we were going actually to open the door to family court, we would both have to submit to a full, invasive, unredacted financial disclosure. I took another step closer, lowering my voice so only he and Jasmine could hear the absolute venom in my words. I asked him if he really wanted a family court judge, a state investigator, and a team of forensic accountants digging into his current net worth. I told him that a judge would look at my completely spotless record as a devoted mother, and then that same judge would look at a man drowning in millions of dollars of highly illegal hidden debt. I pointed out that family court judges tend to frown upon potential guardians who use stolen client funds to cover catastrophic high-risk offshore crypto and gambling losses. Bradley physically recoiled as if I had just struck him across the face with a baseball bat. The color rushed completely out of his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost trapped inside a custom Italian suit. His jaw actually dropped open. He struggled to draw a breath, his lungs suddenly forgetting how to function. The reality of his impending destruction was crushing the breath right out of him. Jasmine completely lost her smug, condescending smirk. The emerald green designer dress she was wearing seemed to swallow her whole as her eyes widened in sheer terror. She grabbed Bradley's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. She hissed at him to say something to deny the accusations, but Bradley remained completely paralyzed. He tried to silence her, but his hands were shaking so violently that he dropped his silver pen onto the marble floor. The arrogant, untouchable predator had suddenly become the terrified prey. He realized in that paralyzing moment that his deepest, darkest, most fatal secret was no longer secure. He knew that I possessed the exact information needed to send him to a federal penitentiary. The silence in the waiting area became absolutely deafening. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the lobby echoed through the space like a judge striking a heavy wooden block. Bradley opened his mouth to utter some frantic, desperate denial, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Before he could scrape together a single lie, a heavy metallic click broke the suffocating tension. The massive mahogany doors leading to the private conference room swung inward with a slow, deliberate creak. Standing in the threshold was Mr. Harrison. He was an imposing, distinguished figure, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit. He held a thick leather-bound binder containing our parents' final wishes and the entire future of the estate. Mr. Harrison calmly surveyed the chaotic scene in the reception area. His sharp, calculating eyes darted from the pale, sweating face of my terrified brother to the crumpled $10,000 check still crushed in Bradley's shaking fist. Finally, his gaze landed directly on me. The elderly lawyer did not look surprised, and he certainly did not look annoyed by the commotion. Instead, a faint, knowing smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He knew exactly what was about to happen in that room. He turned his attention back to my trembling brother, his voice carrying the cold, undeniable weight of absolute authority. "Put that trash away, Bradley. The only person with real power in this room just walked in." Mr. Harrison stepped aside, holding the heavy wooden door open with a firm hand. He gestured for me to enter the private conference room. I walked past my brother without giving him a second glance, my scuffed boots sinking into the plush navy blue carpet. The room smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and lemon polish. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by high-backed executive chairs. I chose a seat near the window, bathed in the natural morning light, completely relaxed and entirely in control. Bradley and Jasmine followed a few seconds later. My brother was physically rigid, his face still pale from our confrontation in the lobby. He practically shoved his hired attorney toward a chair in the corner, signaling the man to remain absolutely silent. Bradley pulled out a chair across from me and sat down heavily. He tugged at the knot of his silk tie, struggling to draw a full breath. He was terrified, but his massive ego refused to let him stay defeated for long. I could see his mind working frantically, convincing himself that the inheritance he was about to receive would magically fix his catastrophic legal and financial nightmare. Jasmine took the seat right next to him. She smoothed the skirt of her emerald green designer dress and immediately shifted her demeanor. She tried to arrange her face into a mask of dignified mourning, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, but the raw, unadulterated greed radiating from her body was impossible to hide. She was practically vibrating with anticipation. She kept glancing at the thick leather folder resting in front of Mr. Harrison, eyeing it like a starving predator looking at a fresh kill. She was already spending the money in her head, mentally paying off her repossessed vehicles and maxed-out credit cards. Mr. Harrison took his seat at the head of the mahogany table. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and opened the heavy folder, the sharp snap of the metal rings breaking the total silence of the room. He did not offer any warm condolences or engage in useless small talk. He operated with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a man who had executed hundreds of high-net-worth estates. He pulled out a crisp stack of legal documents printed on thick, watermarked paper. "We are here today to execute the final will and testament of Thomas and Martha," Mr. Harrison stated, his deep voice carrying absolute authority. "I will read the primary distribution of assets precisely as instructed by the deceased. I expect no interruptions until the initial reading is entirely concluded." Bradley nodded sharply, wiping his sweaty palms against the fabric of his tailored trousers. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished wood of the table, his eyes locked onto the documents. Mr. Harrison began reciting the standard legal preamble detailing the revocation of all prior wills and the confirmation of his firm as the primary executor. The legal jargon filled the room for several minutes. I sat perfectly still, keeping my hands folded on my lap, watching my brother monitor every single syllable. The fear of federal prison was hanging right over his head, a guillotine waiting to drop. He needed this money to cover his $5 million embezzlement, and he needed it today. Regarding the distribution of physical assets, Mr. Harrison read aloud, turning to the second page of the document. "The vintage automobile collection, including the fully restored 1968 Shelby Mustang and the 1970 Jaguar, is hereby bequeathed in its entirety to my son Bradley." A sharp exhale of relief escaped Bradley's lips. The color slowly began to return to his cheeks. Those cars alone were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction. He could liquidate them immediately to start plugging the massive hole in his fraudulent hedge fund. Mr. Harrison continued without missing a beat. "Regarding the primary liquid assets, all checking accounts, savings accounts, and domestic mutual fund portfolios held under the family name are to be transferred immediately and exclusively to my son Bradley." Jasmine let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She gripped Bradley's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. She was completely unable to contain her excitement. I watched her eyes widen with sheer triumph as she calculated the massive influx of cash. She probably thought her country club memberships and high-end shopping sprees were officially secured for the next decade. Bradley's chest puffed out. The terror that had paralyzed him in the hallway was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the toxic, arrogant confidence that had defined his entire life. He actually smirked, shooting a quick, victorious glance in my direction. He firmly believed the worst was over. He thought our father had rewarded his golden child status and left me entirely out in the cold. Mr. Harrison turned to the third page, his voice remaining perfectly monotonous. "Furthermore, the primary family residence, the suburban estate including all attached properties and underlying acreage, is hereby left entirely and unconditionally to my son Bradley. He is granted full legal ownership and the absolute right to mortgage, sell, or modify the property as he sees fit." Jasmine could not hold it in any longer. She let out a loud, highly inappropriate sound of celebration, actually clapping her hands together right in the middle of the solemn legal proceeding. "We did it! she whispered fiercely to Bradley, practically bouncing in her expensive leather chair. "We actually got everything." Bradley leaned back in his seat, exhaling a long, victorious breath. The heavy burden of his impending federal audit seemed to vanish from his shoulders. He felt like a king who had just conquered an empire. He had secured the physical assets, the liquid cash, and the $2 million piece of real estate. In his delusional mind, his master plan was working flawlessly. He would take out an aggressive commercial mortgage against the house, tomorrow pay back the stolen client funds by Friday, and completely dodge the federal investigators. He adjusted his heavy gold watch, projecting the absolute dominance of a man who believed he had just won the ultimate war. He felt untouchable. He felt powerful. He slowly turned his head away from Mr. Harrison and focused his attention entirely on me. I sat quietly across the table, my face showing no anger, no disappointment, and no sorrow. I simply watched him bask in his fake glory. Bradley's eyes narrowed, flashing with absolute malice and cruel satisfaction. He shifted his posture, leaning forward and placing his hands flat on the mahogany table. He had secured the wealth, and now he was ready to deliver his killing blow. Bradley leaned across the polished mahogany, his custom suit shifting as he deliberately invaded my line of sight. The sheer arrogance radiating from his pores was almost suffocating. He wanted to savor this. He wanted to drag out every single second of my supposed humiliation. In his mind, he had just conquered the entire world, and I was merely a peasant waiting to be crushed beneath his expensive leather shoes. He let out a sharp, mocking sigh, shaking his head with an expression of manufactured pity that was utterly repulsive. He looked at me as if I were a stain on the pristine carpet of the law firm. "You know, Claire, I really thought you would have figured it out by now," Bradley sneered, his voice dropping into a harsh, condescending register. "I thought standing out there in the freezing rain might have finally knocked some sense into your head. But looking at you right now wearing those pathetic, worn-out clothes, I realize you are exactly the same lazy burden you have always been. You really thought you could just waltz into this office, flash a sad look, and walk away with a piece of the pie. You actually believed our parents were going to split their legacy with a woman who cannot even hold down a basic corporate job." He tapped his fingers against the table, a rhythmic, taunting beat that echoed off the high walls of the conference room. He was utterly convinced that he had outsmarted everyone. He believed his massive financial crimes were now safely buried under the wealth he had just inherited. "I hope you enjoy being homeless," Claire. Bradley delivered the killing blow, his eyes completely devoid of any familial warmth. "Because I made absolutely sure you get nothing. Zero. Dad knew exactly what you were. He knew you were a complete and utter disappointment. He entrusted everything to me because he knew I was the only one capable of protecting the family name and managing real assets. I am the success story. You are just the cautionary tale. The estate is mine. The accounts are mine. The cars are mine. So pack up your kid, get out of this city, and never ask me for a single dime." Jasmine did not even try to hide her amusement. She threw her head back and let out a loud, grating laugh that completely shattered the professional atmosphere of the legal office. She slapped her hand against the armrest of her chair, practically shaking with cruel delight. "Oh, this is just too perfect," Jasmine crowed, her voice echoing shrilly across the table. "I told you, Bradley, I told you she would show up here looking for a handout." "Well, you heard the man, Claire. The bank is officially closed. You should probably take your kid and leave before rush hour traffic hits. I am sure there is a crowded homeless shelter somewhere on the south side that has an open cot for you. Maybe they will even give you a free bowl of soup if you cry hard enough." She leaned into Bradley, wrapping her arm around his bicep, completely drunk on their perceived victory. They were celebrating my destruction. They were reveling in the thought of my young sons sleeping on the streets. They had completely stripped away any remaining facade of decency, exposing the rotten, greedy core of their entire existence. They were so blinded by their own malice that they could not see the massive trap they were standing in. The hired attorney sitting in the corner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He kept his eyes glued to his legal pad, actively avoiding my gaze. Even he, a man paid exorbitant fees to protect Bradley's interests, seemed visibly disturbed by the sheer, unadulterated cruelty radiating from his client. He recognized that this was no longer a standard legal proceeding. This was a psychological execution. But the execution completely failed. I did not gasp. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in defense of my character or scream at them for insulting my father's memory. I did not give them the satisfying dramatic breakdown they were so desperately craving. I knew that every single word they just threw at me was going to act as the exact anchor that would drag them straight to the bottom of the ocean. Instead, I remained perfectly still. I looked at Bradley's flushed, victorious face, and then I looked at Jasmine's mocking grin. I let the heavy, toxic silence stretch across the room for several agonizing seconds. I methodically reached out my right hand and wrapped my fingers around the crystal water glass sitting in front of me. The ice cubes clinked softly against the expensive glass, the sound sharp and clear in the dead quiet room. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a slow, incredibly calm sip of water. The absolute absence of any emotional reaction from me hit Bradley like a physical wall. His arrogant smile began to falter at the edges. He blinked clearly, thrown off balance by my icy composure. He had expected me to beg. He had expected me to drop to my knees and plead for a fraction of the estate just to feed my son. My stoic predator-like silence was unnerving him, poking a tiny needle-thin hole in his massive balloon of confidence. He opened his mouth to launch another vicious insult, desperate to elicit the reaction he wanted. But before he could force another toxic word from his throat, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. Mr. Harrison, who had been sitting at the head of the table like a stone statue observing the entire display of familial cruelty, finally moved. He did not look at Bradley with respect, nor did he look at Jasmine with tolerance. His face was a mask of cold, unwavering professional judgment. He cleared his throat loudly. The deep, booming sound cut through the remaining tension in the room like a steel blade. He picked up his heavy silver pen and tapped it twice against the solid mahogany desk. The sharp metallic clacks demanded absolute immediate attention. "If you are quite finished, Bradley." Mr. Harrison's voice was devoid of any emotion, yet it carried a weight that pinned my brother instantly to his chair. The lawyer did not wait for a response. He reached into the thick leather folder and pulled out a single distinct sheet of paper. Unlike the previous documents, this page had a red legal seal stamped across the top right corner. "There is one final section," Mr. Harrison announced, his eyes locking directly onto my brother's confused, suddenly pale face. "A codicil added by your father 24 hours before his passing." The word codicil hung in the room like a drop in barometric pressure. The confident, mocking sneer that had been plastered across my brother's face instantly dissolved. His posture stiffened, his shoulders hiking toward his ears as a primal panic set in. Jasmine stopped breathing entirely. Her hands, which had been greedily clutching her designer purse, fell limply to her lap. She darted a frantic look at her husband, but Bradley was completely paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the document bearing the red legal seal. "What codicil?" Bradley demanded, his voice cracking slightly, shedding every ounce of his polished corporate persona. "Dad did not say anything to me about a codicil. We discussed the estate planning recently." Mr. Harrison did not look up from the page. He adjusted his glasses, his expression devoid of pity. "As your father's appointed legal counsel, it is my duty to read his final directives precisely as written. I suggest you remain silent and listen very carefully, Bradley. Your financial future depends entirely on what this document dictates." The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading Thomas's final words. The language was not couched in dense, impenetrable legal jargon. It was sharp, clear, and devastatingly personal. My father had written it with the furious clarity of a man who realized his entire legacy was about to be destroyed by the greed of his golden child. Mr. Harrison read aloud that approximately 1 month before his passing, Thomas initiated a comprehensive private audit of his own personal accounts and the financial ties linking the family estate to Bradley's hedge fund. My father stated in the document that he had uncovered a massive, horrifying discrepancy. He discovered an illegal, systematic diversion of client capital totaling exactly $5 million. Bradley's face turned the color of wet ash. He gripped the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to object, to scream that it was a lie, but his vocal cords were paralyzed by the sheer terror of hearing his federal crimes read aloud in a formal legal setting. Jasmine looked at him, her eyes wide with shock, slowly realizing the $14,000 country club bills were funded by stolen money. Mr. Harrison continued reading without pausing for their reactions. The document explicitly stated that Thomas knew Bradley was utilizing highly leveraged offshore cryptocurrency accounts and illegal sports betting syndicates to hide the missing funds. My father knew that an external regulatory audit was imminent. He knew that when the federal authorities inevitably uncovered the $5 million embezzlement, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation would immediately seize every single asset tied to Bradley's name. That included the family estate, the vintage car collection, and all domestic liquid accounts. To protect the physical legacy of the family from being seized by federal agents in the fallout of his son's criminal behavior, Thomas took extreme legal action. Mr. Harrison explained the trap my father had brilliantly constructed. 24 hours before he suffered his fatal heart attack, Thomas authorized my legal team to transfer all equity, all deeds, and all liquid assets of the estate into a heavily leveraged corporate trust. Bradley let out a strangled gasp. What does that mean? He choked out, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. What did he do? It means your father extracted the actual monetary value out of the estate, Mr. Harrison replied coldly, setting the document down. He took out massive ironclad loans against the primary suburban residence and the vintage automobile collection. He effectively encumbered every single piece of property with millions of dollars in secured corporate debt. He used the estate as collateral to secure an immediate cash payout from a private financial entity, thereby stripping the estate of its tangible equity. He then transferred that cash directly into an impenetrable offshore trust completely outside the jurisdiction of your impending bankruptcy. The reality of the situation crashed down on Bradley with the force of a freight train. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his expensive Italian suit. You inherit the physical titles, Mr. Harrison continued, twisting the knife. You get the deed to the house. You get the ownership papers for the Shelby Mustang and the Jaguar. However, they are fully encumbered by millions of dollars in high-interest debt. You cannot sell them. You cannot mortgage them. If you attempt to use them as collateral for a new loan, you will be committing bank fraud, adding another felony to your rapidly growing list. You are inheriting a negative net worth, Bradley. You are inheriting a multi-million-dollar debt. Jasmine let out a high-pitched wail. She slapped her hands over her face, the illusion of her endless wealth shattering into a million pieces. The lavish vacations, the designer dresses, the luxury cars, all of it was gone. She was legally bound to a man who was about to go to federal prison and who had just inherited a mountain of inescapable corporate debt. Bradley stumbled backward, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His master plan was completely annihilated. He had counted on mortgaging the $2 million estate tomorrow morning to quietly replace the stolen client funds before his regulatory audit next week. Now there was no equity. There was no safety net. The house was financially radioactive. He was trapped, cornered like a rat in a maze with no exits. He frantically grabbed the edge of the table, leaning over it with wild, panicked eyes. His breathing was ragged, spit flying from his lips as he shouted at the lawyer in pure desperation. Who holds the debt? Bradley screamed, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. If Dad leveraged the estate, someone holds the paper. Some bank, some lender. Who is the private creditor holding the absolute lien on my inheritance? I demand to know the exact name of the corporate entity right now. Tell me who owns my life. Mr. Harrison did not flinch at the violent outburst echoing off the high walls of the conference room. He calmly reached forward, perfectly aligned the edges of the watermarked documents, and closed the thick leather folder. The sharp snap of the metal clasp sounded like a vault sealing shut. He looked my brother dead in the eye, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. The elderly attorney interlaced his fingers on the polished mahogany table and let the silence stretch out, forcing Bradley to marinate in his own raw terror. When Mr. Harrison finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and devastatingly clear. He stated that the entity holding the absolute lien on the estate was not a traditional banking institution, nor was it a faceless corporate hedge fund. It was a private financial holding company established specifically to manage an influx of massive newly acquired wealth. Bradley dug his fingers into the edge of the table, his knuckles practically bursting through his pale skin. He demanded the name of the company again, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. The sweat that had been beading on his forehead was now dripping down the side of his face, soaking into the collar of his custom-tailored Italian shirt. Mr. Harrison adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and delivered the fatal strike. The holding company, holding the multi-million-dollar debt on every single asset you just inherited, is wholly owned by your sister Claire. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Bradley's frenzied breathing stopped entirely. He slowly turned his head, his wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto me. I sat in my chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap, wearing the exact same faded wool sweater I had worn when he threw my child into the freezing rain. I did not offer a single word of confirmation or gloating. I simply held his gaze with the cold, unyielding stare of an apex predator, watching its prey step willingly into a snare. A short, hysterical laugh burst from Bradley's throat. It was a jagged, broken sound of pure denial. He pointed a shaking finger at me, leaning forward so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. He yelled that this was a sick, twisted joke. He shouted at the lawyer that I was a completely broke, unemployed loser who could not even afford to pay rent. He insisted that I was a parasite who had just begged him for a place to stay. He looked at his hired attorney, demanding the man object to this ridiculous charade, but his lawyer remained absolutely frozen, staring at the floor. Jasmine chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate. She grabbed the edge of the table, her emerald green dress twisting as she claimed, "I probably did not even have $10 to my name, let alone millions to buy out corporate debt." They were desperately clinging to the false narrative they had used to justify their cruelty for years. Mr. Harrison slammed his open palm against the table. The sudden explosive sound instantly silenced my brother and his wife. The lawyer glared at Bradley with pure disgust. "Claire did not quit her job, Bradley," Mr. Harrison announced, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "She stepped down because she successfully sold her proprietary fintech data analytics firm to a global technology conglomerate." The lawyer did not stop there. He reached into a secondary folder and pulled out a certified bank statement, sliding it directly across the mahogany wood until it rested right beneath Bradley's nose. "The transaction was finalized and fully funded 48 hours ago." Harrison continued, his voice ringing like a death knell. "Her current verified liquid net worth is exactly $65 million. She personally financed the buyout of your father's leveraged debt. She owns the mortgage on the suburban estate. She holds the title liens on the vintage car collection. She owns every single piece of debt attached to your name. You kicked a multimillionaire out of her own property, and now she holds your absolute financial ruin right in the palm of her hand." The color vanished from Bradley's face in an instant, leaving his skin the terrifying shade of spoiled milk. The astronomical figure of $65 million crashed through his skull like a wrecking ball, entirely demolishing his fragile, arrogant reality. His brain struggled to process the magnitude of his fatal mistake. He stared blindly at the certified bank document, his eyes tracing the massive, impossible string of zeros printed under my name. He had evicted a woman who could buy his entire investment firm with pocket change. He had threatened to call Child Protective Services on a woman with enough wealth to bury him in endless litigation for the rest of his natural life. And worst of all, he was relying on the equity of the family estate to save himself from a federal prison sentence, only to discover that the sister he despised held the absolute keys to his cage. His chest began to heave violently. He clawed at his silk tie, ripping it downward as if it were a noose suddenly tightening around his neck. Short, shallow gasps ripped from his throat. The realization that he was completely, inescapably trapped by the very person he had tried to destroy overloaded his brain. He tried to stand up, his hands pressing flat against the table to support his collapsing weight. The shock of the revelation hit his central nervous system like a massive electrical surge. I watched his eyes dart wildly around the room before they suddenly rolled completely back into his skull, exposing nothing but the whites of his eyes. His knees buckled instantly beneath the table. The remaining strength evaporated from his limbs. Bradley collapsed straight backward, the heavy executive chair tipping over with a violent resounding crash. His body hit the floor hard, sprawling across the expensive carpet completely and utterly unconscious. The room fell into a stunned, deafening silence, broken only by the sound of his shallow breathing. The deafening silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds before Jasmine shattered it with a piercing, high-pitched scream. The sound ripped through the professional calm of the law office like shattered glass. She leaped from her heavy leather chair, her hands trembling violently, as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Mr. Harrison. The carefully curated mask of the wealthy suburban socialite melted away, instantly exposing the desperate cornered fraud underneath. "This is a lie!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany walls. "You are completely lying. That document is a fake. Thomas would never give this unemployed loser control over our family estate. You fabricated this entire thing just to steal our money." Mr. Harrison did not even blink. He kept his hands calmly folded on the polished desk, watching her meltdown with the detached observation of a man who had witnessed countless greedy heirs fall apart. "I assure you, madam, the codicil is legally binding, properly witnessed, and officially recorded," Mr. Harrison replied, his voice maintaining its icy professional tenor. "Your father-in-law was of sound mind, and he recognized the severe financial peril your husband had placed this family in. I highly suggest you lower your voice and compose yourself." Jasmine refused to listen. She slammed her hands against the table, her emerald green designer dress twisting awkwardly as she leaned forward, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She turned her venomous glare toward me, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and pure hatred. "You manipulated him!" Jasmine spat, pacing frantically in the small space between her chair and the window. "You probably snuck into his hospital room while he was weak and coerced him into signing everything over to you. You are a disgusting, manipulative gold digger. We are going to sue you, Claire. We are going to sue you, and we are going to sue this entire firm. I will drag you through civil court for the next 20 years, until you are bankrupt and living in a cardboard box." She spun around and glared at the hired attorney who had accompanied them. "Do something," she yelled at him, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You are our lawyer! File an injunction! Call the police! Arrest her for fraud!" The hired attorney did not look at her. His face was entirely pale. He snapped his leather briefcase shut, clicked the lock securely, and stood up from his chair in the corner of the room. He muttered a quick apology to Mr. Harrison, stating that he was officially withdrawing his counsel due to a severe conflict of interest and the sudden emergence of federal criminal implications. Without waiting for a response, the attorney practically sprinted out the heavy oak doors, abandoning his clients to their inevitable ruin. Jasmine watched him flee, her mouth falling open in sheer disbelief. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She looked back at me, desperately searching for any sign of weakness or intimidation. She found absolutely nothing. I slowly stood up from my chair by the window. The scraping of the wooden legs against the carpet drew her immediate attention. I smoothed the front of my faded wool sweater, maintaining a posture of absolute unbothered calm. I took slow, measured steps around the massive mahogany table, walking directly toward the spot where Jasmine was standing. My unconscious brother blocked the narrow walkway between the table and the wall. Bradley lay sprawled on his back, his expensive Italian suit rumpled against the floor, completely dead to the world. I did not pause my stride. I did not walk around him. I simply lifted my scuffed boot and stepped directly over his chest, not sparing him a single glance of pity. I stopped when I was merely inches away from Jasmine. She instinctively took a half-step backward, her back pressing hard against the window pane. She was physically trapped. "You are going to sue me, Jasmine?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut bone. Lawsuits require massive amounts of upfront capital. Lawyers require retainers. You do not have capital. You do not have a retainer. You do not even have enough money to pay for the gas in the luxury SUV you drove here this morning." Jasmine opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her the chance. I brought up the financial dossier my investigation team had compiled, letting the brutal facts crush whatever remaining delusions she was clinging to. "I know exactly what you have been doing behind Bradley's back," I continued smoothly, watching her eyes widen in sudden sheer panic. "I know about the secret credit cards you opened under your maiden name to hide your astronomical shopping sprees. I know about the secondary mortgage you quietly leveraged against the summer cabin just to pay off your private jeweler. Bradley has been stealing millions from his clients to fund his gambling addiction, but you have been actively stealing from Bradley just to maintain your pathetic illusion of high society status." Jasmine shook her head vigorously, tears of absolute panic welling in her eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That is not true. You do not know anything. I know that you currently owe over $400,000 in hidden high-interest personal debt," I stated, quoting the exact figure from my investigator's report. "I know that when Bradley's accounts are seized by the federal government this week, your secret debts will instantly default. Your creditors will tear apart whatever miserable scraps you have left. You wanted me to sign away my rights for $1,000 so you could keep buying designer dresses. Now you are going to leave this building with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back." Jasmine's knees buckled slightly. The reality of her total exposure finally broke her. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a pathetic, broken sob as the undeniable truth of her impending poverty washed over her. She was utterly destroyed, completely dismantled by the very woman she had just threatened to throw into the streets. Down on the floor, a low, guttural groan broke the tension. Bradley twitched his fingers, curling into the expensive carpet. His eyelids fluttered open, heavy and disoriented. He rubbed his temple, blinking rapidly as he tried to orient himself in the brightly lit conference room. He rolled slowly onto his side, his brain desperately trying to piece together the horrifying nightmare he had just woken up in. He looked up and saw me standing over him, my face a mask of cold judgment. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, to ask what was happening to his life, but the words died instantly in his throat. From the busy downtown streets far below the 50th story window, a new sound began to rise. The sharp, unmistakable wail of multiple heavy sirens pierced through the thick glass. The noise grew louder and more frantic, cutting through the silence of the law office until the sirens abruptly shut off directly outside the front entrance of the building. The flashing red and blue lights reflected faintly against the window panes, signaling that the ultimate consequence had finally arrived. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room did not just open. They were violently shoved apart, crashing against the expensive paneled walls with a deafening bang that shook the framed artwork hanging in the corridor. Bradley scrambled backward across the plush carpet, using his elbows to push himself frantically away from the entrance. His disoriented brain was desperately trying to process the sudden noise. He let out a weak, raspy breath, muttering that someone must have called the paramedics when he collapsed. He actually believed the flashing emergency lights far below on the city street were meant to rescue him. Jasmine echoed his delusion, her panicked eyes darting toward the doorway as she yelled that building security had finally arrived to arrest me for trespassing and financial fraud. They were both clinging to the absolute last shreds of their shattered reality. But the figures marching into the executive room were not carrying medical bags, and they were not wearing the standard blazers of corporate building security. A tactical team of 6 individuals poured into the space. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. The men and women at the front of the formation were wearing dark, heavy windbreakers. Emblazoned across their chests and backs in bold, unmissable yellow lettering were the acronyms FBI and SEC. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely impassive expression, stepped directly to the head of the mahogany table. He did not glance at Jasmine, who had pressed herself so hard against the window she looked as though she was trying to melt into the glass. He did not look at Mr. Harrison, who simply remained in his chair watching the scene unfold, with the stoic calm of a lawyer who had seen high-profile clients fall from grace before. The agent locked his gaze entirely on my brother, who was still pathetically sprawled on the floor, his custom suit wrinkled and stained with cold, nervous sweat. Bradley Thomas, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying the lethal weight of the federal government. "You are being placed under arrest." My brother's mouth opened, but only a dry, wheezing sound escaped. He stared at the bold yellow letters on the agent's jacket, his mind completely short-circuiting. He had planned to cover up his crimes tomorrow. He thought he had until the upcoming quarterly audit to replace the missing client funds by leveraging our deceased parents' home. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy sleeping in his luxury suburban estate, the night before, my elite financial investigation team had been meticulously packaging his total destruction. Victor and his forensic accountants had not just compiled the data for my personal amusement. At precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, they had routed an encrypted, irrefutable digital dossier directly to the regional directors of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The dossier contained every single wire transfer, the offshore account routing numbers, and the exact timestamps of Bradley's $5 million embezzlement. I had specifically instructed Victor to highlight the impending audit, flagging my brother as an extreme immediate flight risk who was actively attempting to secure a massive real estate mortgage to obfuscate his crimes. The federal authorities do not wait when millions of dollars of wire fraud are actively bleeding across international borders. They mobilized a strike team before the sun even came up. "There must be some mistake," Bradley choked out, frantically scrambling to get his legs underneath him. He managed to push himself up onto his knees, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "I am a respected fund manager. I have a clean record. My father just died. You have the wrong person. Someone has hacked my corporate servers." The lead agent did not even blink at the pathetic display. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "We have secured forensic logs of your offshore transactions initiating from your personal devices," the agent stated coldly, stepping forward and grabbing Bradley by the bicep. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, embezzlement of corporate funds, and severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "No, no, please!" Bradley shrieked, his voice pitching into absolute hysteria. As the agent forcefully hauled him up from the floor, my brother twisted his head, looking desperately around the room for any lifeline. He looked at Mr. Harrison, begging the lawyer to invoke some sort of estate privilege to halt the arrest. Mr. Harrison simply adjusted his glasses and looked away, completely washing his hands of the criminal standing in his office. Bradley then looked at Jasmine, pleading for his wife to call their expensive defense attorneys. Jasmine was frozen against the glass, her hands covering her mouth, staring in abject horror as she watched her entire source of wealth and social status being physically restrained by federal law enforcement. She did not take a single step forward to help him. The cold metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Bradley's wrists echoed through the room. The sound was definitive. It was the physical manifestation of his completely ruined golden child status. The untouchable, arrogant son who had been given every advantage in life, who had mocked my career and thrown my child out into a freezing rainstorm, was now a detained felon. He was being treated exactly like the common criminal he truly was. Two supporting agents moved in, taking positions on either side of my brother. They gripped his arms firmly, preparing to march him out of the conference room, through the crowded corporate lobby, and into the back of a waiting federal vehicle in broad daylight. The sheer humiliation of being paraded in handcuffs past his peers was already breaking his mind. As the agents turned him toward the doorway, Bradley's bloodshot eyes suddenly locked onto me. He saw me standing quietly by the window, my posture relaxed, my expression completely devoid of any shock or fear. The final devastating realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He remembered my cold promise on the front lawn. He remembered the financial dossier I had just used to destroy his wife. He knew with absolute certainty that the federal raid was not a coincidence. I was the architect of his total annihilation. The agents pulled him forward, intending to drag him out into the hallway. But before they could drag him through the heavy oak doors, all the remaining strength vanished from Bradley's legs. The overwhelming weight of his multi-million-dollar debt, his impending prison sentence, and his total defeat crashed down on his shoulders. He stopped fighting the agent's grip and threw his weight forward, dropping violently onto his knees right in front of my boots. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the floor sent a faint vibration through the thick navy blue carpet. Bradley, the immaculate hedge fund manager who had spent his entire adult life looking down his nose at me from his manufactured pedestal, was now physically groveling at my feet. The federal agents instinctively tightened their grip on his arms, attempting to haul him back to a standing position, but my brother made himself entirely dead weight. He refused to stand. He let his head fall back, exposing his tear-streaked red face to the bright fluorescent lights of the conference room. The pristine corporate facade had completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, broken coward. "Claire, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking into a wretched, high-pitched gasp that completely shattered the quiet dignity of the law office. "Please, you have to help me. You have $65 million. You can fix this right now. You can make all of this go away." He frantically rambled through his desperate demands, completely ignoring the federal agents standing right beside him. He pleaded with me to transfer funds to unfreeze his seized accounts. He begged me to call my private wealth management team and post whatever exorbitant multi-million-dollar bail a federal judge was about to set. He cried that he needed the most ruthless, high-priced white-collar defense attorneys in the country. In his delusional, panicked mind, he still believed that my new fortune existed solely to serve as a safety net for his catastrophic, illegal mistakes. He genuinely believed that my money was the only thing standing between his lavish lifestyle and a decade in a federal penitentiary. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked sharply against his expensive gold watch as he tried to reach out and grab the hem of my jeans. I took a deliberate, slow step backward, ensuring his trembling, sweating fingers grasped nothing but empty air. Realizing that his frantic demands for my money were falling on deaf ears, Bradley desperately shifted his tactics. He abandoned his arrogant business persona entirely and clawed for the one toxic weapon our parents had always used to keep me in line: the concept of family loyalty. "We are family, Claire," he wailed, staring up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "We are blood. Mom and Dad just died. They just died, Claire. They would be absolutely heartbroken to see us like this. Dad would want us to stick together. He left me this estate because he wanted the family name protected, and now you are just standing there letting them destroy me. You have to protect your brother. We have to stick together in times of crisis." I looked down at the weeping, shattered man on the floor, and a profound sense of clarity washed over my entire body. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. I felt absolutely zero empathy for the creature sobbing at my boots. I thought about the bitter, disgusting irony of his words. Exactly 3 weeks ago, in the middle of a freezing, violent downpour, he had stood on the front porch of our childhood home and laughed as my 6-year-old son shivered in the cold. He had not cared about sticking together when he threw our belongings into the mud. He had not cared about our parents' legacy when he called me a jobless parasite and threatened to call Child Protective Services. He only remembered we were family the exact second he realized I was incredibly wealthy and he was completely destitute. I kept my hands casually resting in the pockets of my faded wool sweater. I did not bend down to his level. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not shed a single tear of sympathy. I let him cry for another 10 seconds, letting the federal agents and Mr. Harrison witness the absolute, undeniable cowardice of the golden child. Then I leaned forward ever so slightly. I looked directly into his panicked, desperate eyes, making sure my voice carried the absolute, unyielding coldness of a glacier. "I think you need to learn how to be independent, Bradley," I said slowly, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "Failures do not belong in this family." The words struck him with lethal force. They were his exact words, the very same cruel, condescending insults he had hurled at me from the dry comfort of his luxury porch. Hearing his own toxic narrative weaponized and fed directly back to him caused his jaw to slacken completely. The frantic begging died instantly in his throat. He realized in that agonizing, breathless moment that there was absolutely no mercy left in my heart. I had entirely severed the biological anchor he was trying to use to drag me down. The lead federal agent did not give Bradley another second to process his total defeat. With a sharp, practiced motion, the two agents hauled my brother violently upward, dragging him completely off his knees. Bradley let out a final pathetic wail of despair as they forcibly marched him toward the heavy mahogany doors. His expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly across the carpet, leaving deep, messy tracks in the plush fabric. The doors swung open, revealing a hallway full of shocked paralegals and legal assistants. The agents marched the disgraced, handcuffed hedge fund manager through the crowd. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off his frantic sobbing and leaving the conference room in a sudden, profound silence. Mr. Harrison calmly adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and neatly stacked the remaining estate documents on his desk, utterly unfazed by the dramatic exit. I turned slowly away from the closed door, rolling my shoulders back. The primary threat was gone, but the room was not completely empty. Jasmine was still standing by the large floor-to-ceiling window. She had watched her husband get dragged away to federal prison without moving a single muscle to help him. She slowly lowered her shaking hands from her face. The tears she had been shedding just moments ago evaporated with a frightening speed. The terrified, vulnerable wife routine vanished entirely the second Bradley was no longer in the room. She pushed herself away from the glass, her emerald green designer dress swishing as she straightened her spine. The raw, toxic arrogance that defined her entire existence began to rapidly reinflate. She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, venomous slits. She genuinely believed that because Bradley was the one wearing the handcuffs, she had somehow survived the massacre untouched. She glared at me aggressively, squaring her shoulders, mentally preparing to play her last remaining card, entirely unaware that the deck was already rigged against her. She thought her own legal standing was still secure, a fatal miscalculation she was about to learn the hard way. Jasmine took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing oxygen into her lungs as she pulled herself away from the heavy window pane. The flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass behind her slowly faded into the distance as the federal vehicles carried her husband away. She smoothed down the front of her emerald green designer dress, with trembling hands desperately trying to iron out the physical evidence of her panic. She lifted her chin, tossing her dark braids over her shoulder with a sharp, defiant flick. The terrified, cornered expression she wore just moments ago completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating sneer. She genuinely believed she was immune to the destruction that had just leveled my brother. Jasmine walked slowly toward the center of the room, her high heels clicking sharply against the plush carpet. She stopped a few feet away from the heavy mahogany table, crossing her arms over her chest, and looking down at me with a look of absolute unearned superiority. She thought her own legal standing was still secure, a fatal miscalculation she was about to learn the hard way. "You really think you won, do you not?" Jasmine hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think because you sent the feds after Bradley, you have somehow destroyed my life too? Well, you are wrong, Claire. You are completely, pathetically wrong." I remained standing by the window watching her erratic performance with mild curiosity. I did not interrupt her. I let her build her own fragile pedestal, knowing exactly how hard the fall was going to be. Bradley was a sloppy, arrogant fool. Jasmine continued pacing back and forth with a newfound manic energy. He was careless with his client accounts, and he was careless with his digital security. I always knew his massive ego would eventually catch up with him. But I am not Bradley. I am much smarter than he is. I knew his hedge fund was bleeding cash months ago. I saw the warning signs before the federal regulators even knew his name, and I made absolute certain that my own financial future was totally secure before his entire house of cards collapsed. She stopped pacing and planted her feet, firmly pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You can keep this depressing suburban estate," Jasmine bragged, gesturing wildly around the law office, as if she were discarding trash. You can keep the vintage cars, the empty domestic bank accounts, and whatever miserable scraps Thomas and Martha left behind. I do not want any of it. I do not need it. Because while Bradley was busy burying himself in federal wire fraud, I made him transfer the deed to the Aspen property entirely into my name. She let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. It was a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. She was talking about the massive luxury vacation home nestled deep in the Colorado mountains. It was a sprawling, multi-level ski lodge featuring panoramic views, heated indoor pools, and a private access road. It was the crown jewel of my brother's real estate portfolio, easily valued at over $2 million on the open market. I am the sole legal owner of that property, Jasmine stated, her voice rising with manic pride. My name is the only name on that deed. It is a completely separate asset, totally isolated from Bradley's failing hedge fund, and completely untouchable by your little corporate trust trap. So while you sit here playing the victorious, wealthy sister, I am going to call my luxury real estate broker. I am going to list that mountain lodge for a quick cash-only sale. I will liquidate that property by the end of the month, take my $2 million, and leave this miserable country long before Bradley even sees the inside of a federal courtroom. I am walking away rich, Claire. You get to keep the family drama, and I get to keep the cash. She smiled a wide, victorious smile, genuinely believing she had executed the perfect escape plan. She thought she had outmaneuvered the federal government, outsmarted her criminal husband, and completely defeated me. I looked at her, my expression remaining completely blank. I did not show an ounce of shock, anger, or defeat. I simply turned away from the window, my scuffed boots making no sound on the thick carpet. I walked slowly back to the large mahogany table. Mr. Harrison watched me in total silence, leaning back in his executive chair, fully aware that the execution was not quite finished. I pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and sat down gracefully. I kept my posture relaxed, my shoulders loose, projecting the absolute calm of a woman who held every single winning card in the deck. I reached into the plain canvas tote bag I had brought with me and retrieved a single pristine manila folder. I placed it gently on the polished wood surface of the table. Jasmine watched my movements carefully. Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The manic confidence radiating from her began to dim as she stared at the closed folder. She shifted her weight suddenly, looking unsure of her own brilliant escape plan. Her breathing quickened again, the heavy fabric of her dress rising and falling as a new wave of paranoia crept into her mind. "You talk a lot, Jasmine," I said, my voice quiet and level, slicing through the heavy air of the conference room. "You boast about your intelligence and your strategic planning. You truly believe you are the smartest person in this building. But you made one massive, catastrophic mistake." I opened the pristine folder. Inside was a thick stack of printed financial documents, heavily redacted with black marker, but displaying crystal-clear routing numbers, transaction dates, and offshore holding accounts. They were the exact same wire transfer logs my elite forensic accounting team had presented to me in my penthouse earlier that morning. I picked up the first stack of papers and held them firmly in my hand. When you orchestrate a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction to hide assets from federal regulators, you should probably make sure the money you are using is actually clean, I stated coldly. Jasmine stopped breathing. Her eyes locked onto the documents in my hand, her pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained completely from her face, returning her to the exact state of panic she had been in just 10 minutes prior. I slid the thick stack of bank transfers smoothly across the polished mahogany table. The papers glided effortlessly, stopping precisely at the edge of the table, directly in front of where Jasmine was standing. "Did you really think I wouldn't trace where the embezzled money went?" Jasmine stared down at the heavily redacted financial logs resting on the polished mahogany table. She refused to physically touch the papers, as if the mere contact with the ink would instantly burn her hands. She shook her head in erratic, jerky movements, desperately trying to reject the mathematical reality staring her right in the face. She claimed the papers meant absolutely nothing. She insisted that her name was exclusively on the deed and therefore the property was hers by absolute legal right. She called my documents fake, accusing me of printing out random corporate spreadsheets just to scare her into backing down. I leaned forward in my leather executive chair, resting my forearms on the table. I instructed her to look closely at the third page, specifically the routing numbers originating from Bradley's primary hedge fund account. I told her to trace the exact date of that massive wire transfer. It was initiated exactly 48 hours before the deed to the Aspen Vacation Lodge was legally transferred solely into her name. Bradley did not buy that luxury mountain property with his hard-earned corporate bonuses. He bought it by draining the retirement accounts of his highest-paying clients. He funneled stolen money directly into a real estate holding company, and then he explicitly gifted that fraudulent asset to his wife. Jasmine crossed her arms tightly across her chest, digging her manicured nails into her own skin. She stubbornly insisted that she did not know where the money came from, claiming her complete ignorance shielded her from any liability. She stated that since she was not a registered partner at his hedge fund, the federal government had absolutely no right to touch her private mountain lodge. She was desperately clinging to the false hope that her status as a clueless suburban housewife granted her total immunity from federal prosecution and asset seizure. I could not help but let a cold, genuine smile touch my lips. I asked her if she was truly naive enough to believe that the Federal Bureau of Investigation cared whose name was printed on a piece of paper when the underlying funds were secured through massive corporate wire fraud. I broke down the brutal, inescapable reality of federal asset forfeiture laws for her. I explained the basic concept of the fruit of the poisonous tree. When a federal crime is committed, any asset purchased with the proceeds of that crime is immediately subject to government seizure. It does not matter if the property is hidden in a trust transferred to a spouse or buried in an offshore holding company. The federal agents do not politely ask for permission to take it back. They simply take it. I tapped my index finger against the thick stack of bank transfers lying between us. I informed Jasmine that I had not just kept these documents for my own personal amusement. At the exact same time my forensic team sent Bradley's embezzlement records to the authorities, we also forwarded the complete unredacted property transfer logs for the Aspen Lodge. I told her that a federal judge had already signed an emergency asset freeze on the property early this morning. The mountain house was officially locked down pending a full criminal investigation. It was completely radioactive. Jasmine's breath hitched violently in her throat. The manic, triumphant energy that had possessed her just moments ago evaporated completely, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. She realized her brilliant escape plan was nothing but a complete fantasy. She could not call her luxury real estate broker to secure a quick cash sale. She could not liquidate the property and flee the country with a sudden windfall. If she even attempted to sell that house, she would be actively engaging in the sale and distribution of stolen federal assets. She would be instantly indicted as an active co-conspirator in her husband's multi-million-dollar fraud scheme and dragged away in handcuffs right alongside him. She was officially left with absolutely nothing. The emerald green designer dress she was wearing, the expensive leather handbag she clutched so tightly, and the luxury vehicle she drove to the law office were all funded by illicit stolen money. Her entire identity, built on projecting extreme wealth and unearned superiority over me, had just been legally and financially demolished. She had $0 in her personal accounts. Her secret credit lines were completely maxed out and declining. Her husband was currently on his way to a federal holding facility. Her pristine mountain getaway was seized by the United States government. She was completely, utterly financially destitute. Jasmine slumped backward against the heavy wooden window frame, her legs barely able to support her own weight. She stared at me with wide, hollow eyes, finally understanding the true magnitude of her absolute destruction. She opened her mouth to beg, to try and leverage some twisted sense of familial duty, hoping I might offer her a fraction of the pity she had completely denied me a few days ago. But I did not give her the chance to utter a single pathetic word. I stood up from the mahogany table, smoothing out the wrinkles in my faded wool sweater. I slowly raised my left arm, pulling back my sleeve to reveal the rare, custom-made luxury timepiece fastened securely around my wrist. It was a subtle, highly exclusive model that only someone deeply embedded in the elite financial world would recognize. Jasmine's eyes darted to the watch, silently processing the quiet, devastating wealth I had kept completely hidden from them all this time. I looked at the flawless dial, calculating the exact time of day. I locked eyes with my terrified sister-in-law, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. I hold the immediate legally executed debt on the primary suburban estate. I told her, my tone dropping to a chilling level of calm. My private security detail and a certified eviction crew are already stationed at the end of the driveway. I let my arm drop back to my side, delivering the final fatal instruction. You have exactly 2 hours to vacate the primary estate before the bank changes the locks. I would hurry if I were you. Jasmine did not utter another word. She practically tore the heavy conference room door off its hinges as she fled the law office, her high heels echoing frantically down the corridor. I remained in my seat for a few moments, savoring the absolute quiet that followed her panicked exit. I thanked Mr. Harrison for his precise execution of my father's legal trap, gathered my pristine manila folder, and headed down to the lobby. It was time to reclaim my childhood home. By the time my private armored SUV pulled into the sprawling circular driveway of the suburban estate, exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes had passed. The heavy storm from previous days had completely stopped, leaving the manicured lawns looking bruised and muddy. I stepped out of the vehicle, flanked by 4 towering private security contractors wearing dark suits and earpieces. A large, unmarked moving truck pulled in right behind us, idling quietly as the crew waited for my command. I walked up the grand stone steps and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The interior of the house was in a state of absolute destructive chaos. Jasmine was treating the eviction like a smash-and-grab robbery. The foyer was littered with discarded velvet hangers and empty shoeboxes. I could hear her frantic, heavy breathing echoing from the master suite upstairs. I signaled my security team to follow me. We ascended the grand, sweeping staircase, our footsteps completely silent against the thick carpet. When I reached the doorway of the master bedroom, I leaned against the frame and watched the pathetic spectacle unfolding inside. Jasmine was violently tearing designer gowns from the custom mahogany closets and shoving them indiscriminately into 4 massive monogrammed luxury travel trunks. Her hands were shaking so severely that she kept dropping expensive diamond necklaces and gold watches onto the hardwood floor. She was hyperventilating, desperately trying to salvage every single piece of her manufactured wealthy aesthetic before her time officially ran out. I checked my watch. You have exactly 15 minutes left, Jasmine. I announced, my voice slicing through the frantic rustling of silk and leather. She spun around, letting out a sharp gasp. She looked at me, then looked at the 4 massive security contractors standing shoulder to shoulder behind me. The last remaining color drained entirely from her face. She frantically zipped up the largest travel trunk and grabbed the handle, attempting to drag it toward the hallway. She aggressively ordered my men to step aside, claiming she was taking her personal property and vacating the premises. The security detail did not move a single inch. They stood like absolute stone walls. I took a slow step into the bedroom. I looked down at the bulging luxury trunks, then looked directly into her terrified eyes. I informed her that she was severely misunderstanding the terms of a federal asset freeze. I explained that those diamond necklaces, the custom designer gowns, and even the monogrammed luggage she was clutching were all purchased using credit cards directly linked to Bradley's fraudulent hedge fund accounts. Therefore, they were all considered products of federal embezzlement. If she attempted to remove them from the property, my security team would legally detain her for theft of seized assets and hand her directly over to the authorities. Jasmine's jaw dropped. She released the handle of the luxury trunk as if it had suddenly caught fire. She stepped backward, her hands hovering in the air. She frantically asked what she was supposed to do, screaming that she could not just walk out into the cold wearing nothing but a single dress. I gestured to a small, cheap duffel bag she had tossed into the corner of the room. I told her she was allowed to take exactly 2 standard suitcases containing basic non-designer clothing and essential toiletries. Nothing more. Everything else belonged to the federal government or to the estate that I now completely controlled. She stared at me, her chest heaving with sheer panic. She realized I was forcing her to experience the exact same brutal humiliation she had inflicted upon me just 3 weeks ago. She had stood on the front porch and laughed while my child's meager belongings were hurled into the freezing mud. Now she was being stripped of her entire fake identity and thrown out into the streets. Jasmine fell to her knees. The arrogant, hostile woman who had constantly mocked my career and told me to find a cleaning job completely shattered. She abandoned her pride entirely. She began to weep, begging me to show some mercy. She crawled toward my boots, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Claire, please," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "I have absolutely nowhere to go. My accounts are frozen. My credit cards are declined. I do not even have cash for a hotel room. I cannot go to a homeless shelter. You cannot make me live like a peasant. Just give me a few $1,000s. You have 65 million. $5,000 is nothing to you. Just give me enough to rent a decent apartment until I figure this out." I looked down at her grasping hands. I felt absolutely zero empathy. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for the tears streaming down her face. She had felt no guilt when she told a 6-year-old boy to sleep in the rain. I reached into the pocket of my jeans. I did not pull out my checkbook. I did not pull out a stack of $100 bills. I pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. I held it out and let it flutter down, landing perfectly on the carpet right in front of her knees. "Use that to pay for an Uber," I told her, my voice carrying the freezing mechanical coldness of absolute karma. "I hear the budget motels off the interstate are very clean this time of year. Your time is up. Get out of my house." I signaled the security team. 2 towering men stepped forward, gripped Jasmine by the arms, and hoisted her to her feet. They handed her the 2 small, unbranded suitcases she had managed to pack and forcibly marched her out of the master suite. She kicked and screamed the entire way down the grand staircase, wailing about how unfair it was, cursing my name and begging for a second chance. I followed them down to the foyer and stood in the open doorway. The security guards deposited Jasmine roughly onto the front driveway, just as a cheap, dented yellow cab pulled up to the curb. My team had called it for her. Jasmine stumbled toward the cab, clutching her 2 meager bags and the crumpled $20 bill. She turned back to look at me one last time, her face a mask of total broken despair. She opened her mouth to hurl one final insult, to beg for one last ounce of pity. I did not give her the chance. I grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak door and slammed it shut directly in her face. The massive lock clicked into place with a heavy, satisfying finality. I stood in the quiet foyer of my reclaimed childhood home, breathing in the silent, peaceful air. The toxic, greedy parasites had been entirely eradicated from the property. I had completely won the war. But just as I turned to walk toward the kitchen, my phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. It buzzed continuously, a relentless, aggressive rhythm that signaled a massive influx of incoming data. I pulled the device out and looked at the glowing screen. I had dozens of missed calls, hundreds of unread text messages, and a flood of frantic voicemails. The news of Bradley's federal arrest and Jasmine's brutal eviction had already leaked. The enablers, the hypocrites, and the flying monkeys of my extended family had just heard the news, and they were officially coming for me. My extended family had just heard the news, and they were officially coming for me. My phone lit up with furious texts from relatives who had ignored me for a decade. They were suddenly invested now that the golden child was sitting in a federal cell. I silenced my device, refusing to engage in a digital shouting match. I headed straight back to the sanctuary of my downtown penthouse. Toxic families do not respect boundaries. Soon the secure intercom chimed with an alert. The concierge informed me that my relatives had bypassed the security gate by tailgating. They were storming the lobby, demanding to see me and threatening to call the press. I could hear my Aunt Carol shouting in the background. I told the concierge to let them up. It was time to exterminate the infection at its root. I stood absolutely still in the exact center of my glass-walled living room. I did not prepare refreshments or arrange chairs. I simply waited. The private elevator doors slid open, spilling my bloodline directly into my home. Aunt Carol, Uncle David, and 3 relatives marched inside like an invading force. For a fleeting second, their aggressive momentum stalled. Their eyes widened as they took in the soaring 40-foot ceilings, the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, and the undeniable opulence of the $65 million lifestyle they had no idea I possessed. Uncle David actually stopped breathing for a moment, his gaze locked on the original modern art pieces hanging on my walls. But their deep-seated need to control the family narrative quickly overpowered their awe. Aunt Carol, a woman who had spent my entire life judging my clothes and minimizing my achievements, stepped forward. Her face was flushed dark red with self-righteous fury. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my chest. She screamed that I was a heartless monster. She demanded to know how I could allow my own flesh and blood to be dragged away by federal agents like a common thug. I did not offer them a seat or a glass of water. I just stared at her with the cold, unyielding silence of a judge presiding over guilty defendants. Uncle David stepped up beside his wife, puffing out his chest to look intimidating. He yelled that the entire family reputation was being dragged through the mud. He told me that Bradley's arrest was all over the evening news, and Jasmine was sitting in a cheap motel lobby, crying. He demanded that I immediately contact my wealth management team, wire the necessary funds to post Bradley's exorbitant bail, and hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in the state. He then commanded me to transfer $500,000 to Jasmine immediately, so she could secure luxury housing and protect the family from public humiliation. "You have millions of dollars, Claire," Uncle David bellowed, his voice echoing off the floor to ceiling windows. "You can fix this right now. You can make this entire nightmare go away. Bradley is your brother and he is blood. You have a moral obligation to protect the family name, and you are acting like a spiteful child because of some petty sibling rivalry." I slowly looked directly at the highly hostile group of aggressive relatives completely surrounding me. These were the exact same people who had stood by and watched my parents shower Bradley with relentless praise while I was treated like a disappointment. These were the people who conveniently lost their voices when Bradley threw my 6-year-old son out into a freezing rainstorm just 3 weeks ago. Not a single one of them had offered me a couch to sleep on or asked if Leo had a warm meal. They had completely ignored my suffering because it was socially convenient for them. Now, because their beloved golden child had been exposed as a massive federal criminal, they were demanding my money and loyalty to clean up his mess. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that forced them all to instantly shut their mouths and listen. I told them that I did not owe Bradley a single dime. I stated clearly that Bradley had stolen $5 million from his own clients to fund illegal offshore gambling syndicates. I reminded them that Jasmine had happily spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of that stolen money on designer handbags and country club fees, while looking down her nose at me. I told them that their precious family reputation was already worthless because it was built on a foundation of massive federal fraud. Aunt Carol let out a dramatic, horrified gasp. She clutched her pearl necklace as if I had physically struck her. She refused to accept the reality of the situation. She desperately clung to the delusion that Bradley was simply a misunderstood genius who had made a minor accounting error. "You are destroying your brother's life over money," Aunt Carol shrieked, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. "You are ruining our family out of pure spite. Your father would be absolutely ashamed of you." The room fell into a suffocating dead silence. They all stared at me, believing that invoking my deceased father's memory would be the ultimate trump card to break my spirit and force me into submission. They expected me to crumble under the heavy weight of filial guilt. Instead, I smiled. It was an icy, predatory smile that made Uncle David take a physical step backward. I reached smoothly into the front pocket of my dark denim jeans and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the bright screen, opening a highly secure audio file I had saved for this exact moment. I looked Aunt Carol dead in the eyes. I think you all need to stand there and hear exactly what my late father truly thought of his precious, arrogant, golden child, right before he passed away, I said softly. I pressed play. The digital audio file began to play through the high-fidelity speakers integrated into the ceiling of my penthouse. The sound of my late father's voice filled the massive living room. His tone was weak, ravaged by the severe stress that had ultimately caused his fatal heart attack, yet his words were delivered with absolute devastating clarity. Claire, if you are hearing this recording, it means Bradley's financial crimes have finally caught up with him. My father's voice echoed across the open space. I know exactly what he did. I know he embezzled millions of dollars from his own clients to fund a massive gambling addiction. I also know exactly what our extended family will do when the truth inevitably comes out. The group of hostile relatives standing in my living room instantly froze. Aunt Carol's jaw dropped completely open. Uncle David stopped breathing. The righteous anger they had marched in with evaporated, replaced by a sudden paralyzing dread, as my father's recorded voice continued completely dismantling their entire world from beyond the grave. Your Aunt Carol, your Uncle David, and the rest of them will undoubtedly rally behind him, my father stated bluntly. They have spent decades enabling his arrogance because he bought them expensive dinners and gave them the illusion of high society status. They will try to bully you into saving him. They will demand you fix his mess to protect the family name. That is exactly why I executed the legal codicil. I deliberately stripped the estate of its equity and sold the debt directly to your holding company. I gave you the absolute power because you are the only person in this entire bloodline with actual integrity. Do not let them manipulate you, Claire. Protect yourself and protect Leo. Let Bradley face the federal prison sentence he earned. The recording clicked off, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. I slipped my smartphone back into the front pocket of my jeans and stared at the group of trembling, pale-faced hypocrites standing on my imported rug. I did not give them a single second to formulate a defense or twist the narrative. I stepped forward, forcing Uncle David to physically back away from me. You heard him, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like broken glass. My father knew exactly who you all were. He knew you were nothing but a group of shallow, enabling parasites who worshipped the illusion of wealth. Aunt Carol tried to open her mouth, sputtering a weak, pathetic denial about how they only wanted what was best for everyone, but I immediately shut her down. Do not even try to speak, I commanded, stepping closer and fixing her with a gaze of pure ice. I remember every single thing you people have done. I remember 5 years ago when I needed a small loan to cover emergency medical bills for Leo. Uncle David, you told me you were completely broke and could not spare a single dime. Yet the very next week you proudly co-signed a massive loan for Bradley so he could buy a brand new sports car. You claimed it was a necessary business expense to maintain his elite corporate image. I turned my fierce gaze back to Aunt Carol, watching her physically shrink under my intense scrutiny. And you, Aunt Carol? I continued, not raising my voice but letting the venom coat every word. You spent the last decade praising Jasmine at every holiday dinner. You complimented her diamond earrings and her expensive designer bags, knowing full well she treated me like absolute garbage. You sat at her lavish dining table drinking vintage wine paid for by stolen client funds, and you had the audacity to lecture me about how I needed to work harder to be a good mother. You worshipped a literal criminal and a desperate fraud because you wanted a front row seat to their fake luxury. The relatives looked at each other, completely stripped of their false moral high ground. The aggressive indignation they had marched in with was entirely gone, replaced by the crushing realization that they had backed the wrong horse. They had placed all their bets on a federal felon and completely alienated the sister who held a legitimate $65 million fortune. You came into my home today to demand my money, I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. You tried to guilt-trip me into saving a man who threw my young child into the freezing rain. You wanted me to bail out a criminal and fund his wife's luxury lifestyle, just so you would not have to deal with the social embarrassment of having a felon in the family. You do not care about Bradley. You only care about yourselves. Uncle David raised his hands in a pathetic, submissive gesture. He tried to force a weak, nervous smile, attempting to change his tone to something placating and desperate. Claire, please let us just calm down and talk about this reasonably. We are your family. We need to stick together. No, I stated with absolute unyielding finality. You are not my family. Family protects each other. Family tells the truth. You are just people who happen to share my DNA, and as of this exact moment, that biological connection is completely and permanently severed. I reached into my pocket and pressed a small discreet button on a remote fob attached to my keys. The signal went directly to my building's elite security team stationed downstairs. I am officially cutting all ties with every single one of you, I announced, looking at their shocked faces. I do not want to see you at holidays. I do not want phone calls. I do not want wedding invitations or birthday announcements. You chose to align yourselves with a toxic, abusive fraud. Now you get to live with the permanent consequences of that choice. The heavy metal doors of my private elevator slid open with a soft chime. 4 towering security guards stepped out into my foyer. They wore dark suits and earpieces, moving with the same precise, intimidating efficiency as the federal agents who had arrested my brother earlier today. The head of security looked at me for instruction. These people are trespassing, I told the guards, not taking my eyes off Aunt Carol's horrified face. Escort them off the premises immediately. If any of them attempt to enter this building again, or if they try to contact me, call the police and have them arrested for harassment. The guards immediately moved forward, forming a physical wall of solid muscle between me and my former relatives. Uncle David tried to protest, stammering about his rights, but a guard simply placed a massive hand on his shoulder and physically turned him toward the open elevator. Aunt Carol began to cry, actual tears of regret spilling down her cheeks as she finally realized the monumental scale of what she had just lost. She reached a hand out toward me, softly pleading my name, but I simply turned my back on her and walked over to my floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the reflection in the glass as the security team herded the sputtering, utterly defeated group of enablers into the elevator car. The relatives stood huddled together in the small space, their faces pale, shocked, and entirely stripped of their pride. They looked exactly like what they were, a group of desperate parasites who had just been permanently locked out of the castle. The heavy metal doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing them inside and cutting off their pathetic apologies. A profound, beautiful silence fell over my massive penthouse. I stood alone, looking out over the glittering Chicago skyline, taking a long, deep breath of the crisp, clean air. The heavy, suffocating weight of decades of toxic family dynamics vanished from my shoulders. The war was officially over. Over the next 12 months, the absolute destruction of my brother's manufactured empire played out with the precise, methodical rhythm of a ticking clock. The federal machine moved swiftly, grinding Bradley's arrogant life into fine dust. I watched it all happen from a safe, comfortable distance, receiving regular, highly detailed updates from my legal and financial teams. The swiftness of his downfall was almost breathtaking. The Securities and Exchange Commission completely dismantled his hedge fund within the first 30 days. Federal investigators raided his corporate offices, seizing every single hard drive, every paper ledger, and every encrypted server. His wealthy elite clients, the same people he had desperately tried to impress by flaunting stolen money, immediately turned against him. They filed a massive unified class action lawsuit that drained whatever miserable pennies he had hidden in secondary accounts. He was stripped of his financial licenses permanently. Jasmine's descent into absolute poverty was equally spectacular and entirely self-inflicted. The federal asset forfeiture protocols I had explained to her in the law office were executed with ruthless efficiency. The government officially seized the luxury mountain lodge in Aspen, boarding up the doors and placing a heavy padlock on the front gate. The bank officially foreclosed on the primary suburban estate, changing the locks and physically barring her from retrieving anything beyond the 2 cheap suitcases I had allowed her to pack. Stripped of her stolen wealth, her high-limit credit cards, and her fake social status, Jasmine experienced a brutal collision with the real world. 6 months after she stood on my porch and told me to find a cleaning job, my private security team spotted her working the cash register at a massive discount retail warehouse just outside the city limits. The woman who once wore $1,000 designer silk robes was now wearing a stiff, unflattering polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. She spent her days scanning cheap merchandise and bagging groceries for minimum wage, desperately trying to survive on a meager paycheck that barely covered the rent of her tiny, dilapidated studio apartment. She looked exhausted, her posture permanently slumped, the toxic arrogance completely beaten out of her by the crushing weight of real, inescapable poverty. She no longer had an audience to impress, and the superficial friends she had bought with stolen money completely abandoned her the second her credit card started declining. 11 months after the night in the freezing rain, the final act of this tragedy took place inside a federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. I decided to attend the sentencing hearing. I did not go to gloat, and I certainly did not go to offer any form of familial support. I went because I needed to witness the absolute legal conclusion of the nightmare my brother had created. I slipped into the courtroom quietly, taking a seat in the very back row. The heavy wooden benches were mostly empty, save for a few junior reporters and disgruntled former clients waiting to see justice served. I wore a simple tailored charcoal suit, projecting the quiet confidence of a woman who had already won. The heavy side door of the courtroom opened, and a federal marshal escorted my brother into the room. Bradley looked completely unrecognizable. The slick, arrogant hedge fund manager was entirely gone. He was wearing a baggy, bright orange prison jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. The heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists clanked loudly against his waist chain. His perfectly styled hair was thinning and unkempt, and deep dark bags hung heavily under his hollow eyes. He looked physically aged by at least 20 years. He shuffled toward the defendant's table with his head bowed, his shoulders rounded in total defeat. He did not look around the room. He did not even possess the strength to lift his chin. He was a completely broken man, stripped of every single illusion of superiority he had ever harbored. The federal judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, did not waste any time. He read the comprehensive list of charges aloud, his voice echoing through the silent room. Wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, severe violations of fiduciary duty. The judge looked down at Bradley with absolute contempt, stating that my brother had used his position of power not to build wealth, but to systematically rob hard-working people to fund a pathetic, illegal gambling addiction. Bradley did not offer a single word in his own defense. He just stood there staring blankly at the wooden table, accepting his inevitable fate. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. He officially sentenced Bradley Thomas to 8 years in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored supervised release and a mandate to pay full complete restitution to his victims. I sat in the back row and watched the federal marshals place their hands on Bradley's shoulders. They turned him around to face the center aisle. For a brief fleeting second as he was being marched toward the exit, Bradley's dull, defeated eyes scanned the back of the courtroom. His gaze locked onto mine. I did not smile. I did not flinch. I simply looked back at him with absolute unwavering neutrality. I felt zero pity for the man being dragged away in chains. I was simply watching the natural, unavoidable consequences of his own malicious actions play out in real time. He had built a life on deception, cruelty, and fraud, and the universe had finally handed him the exact bill he deserved. Bradley swallowed hard, breaking eye contact immediately, as he lowered his head and let the marshals drag him through the heavy wooden doors. I stood up from the hard wooden bench, smoothing the fabric of my jacket. I walked out of the courtroom and stepped into the brightly lit, bustling corridor. The air felt incredibly light. My personal security detail was waiting near the exit, standing beside my 6-year-old son. Leo smiled brightly when he saw me dropping the security guard's hand and running over to wrap his arms around my waist. I smiled a genuine, warm smile, completely disconnected from the dark legal proceedings that had just concluded behind me. I knelt down, wrapped my arms tightly around my son, and breathed in the scent of his shampoo. I stood back up and took his small hand in mine. His grip was strong and full of innocent, untainted trust. We walked out of the federal building together, pushing through the heavy glass doors and stepping out into the brilliant, warm afternoon sunlight. The dark, toxic past was permanently locked away behind us, buried under federal indictments and broken illusions. I squeezed Leo's hand, my mind already calculating the massive positive changes I was about to enact. I was absolutely ready to take the very estate my brother had used to threaten me and completely repurpose it into a bright, powerful future. The very first thing I did was finalize the liquidation of the leveraged debt I held over the suburban estate. I cleared the corporate liens, ensuring the property was entirely unencumbered and registered under a brand new philanthropic entity. I refused to live in that house. The sprawling structure held far too many suffocating memories of constant criticism and my brother's arrogance. I did not want my son growing up in hallways where his mother had been repeatedly told she was a disappointment. Instead, I decided to tear down the toxic legacy my parents built and replace it with something undeniably powerful. I hired a commercial construction crew to completely gut the interior of the mansion. We tore down the stuffy formal dining room where my family used to sit and mock my career choices. We ripped out the mahogany closets where Jasmine frantically tried to pack her stolen designer dresses. We dismantled the oppressive architecture of my past and opened up the entire floor plan. In their place, we installed state-of-the-art server rooms, collaborative coding spaces, and fully equipped robotics laboratories. The manicured front lawn, the exact spot where Bradley had hurled my son's belongings into the freezing mud, was transformed into an interactive outdoor learning environment. Within 6 months, the estate officially opened its doors as the Azure Tech Foundation. It became a fully funded, entirely free educational center dedicated exclusively to teaching advanced computer science and financial literacy to underprivileged youth. I wanted to give kids who came from nothing the exact same tools I had used to build my $65 million fortune. I wanted to teach them how to build software and secure their own financial independence. On grand opening day, I stood in the center of the newly renovated atrium holding Leo's hand. The halls were buzzing with the chaotic, beautiful energy of dozens of bright, eager children sitting at high-end workstations. Leo pulled at my sleeve, pointing excitedly to a 3D printer, actively constructing a plastic rocket ship. Watching his pure joy in the exact physical space where we had once been humiliated felt like the ultimate victory. I had completely eradicated the ghosts of my family's greed and replaced them with a legacy of growth opportunity and authentic giving. My true family was standing right beside me. It was just me and my son, and we were more than enough. Later that evening, long after the foundation's grand opening had concluded, and Leo was fast asleep, I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony of my downtown penthouse. The night air was crisp and cool against my skin. I leaned against the heavy glass railing holding a steaming mug of dark roast coffee and looked out over the glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline. The towering skyscrapers glowed like pillars of gold against the dark sky, forming a sprawling empire of glass and steel. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a profound, unshakable peace settle deep into my bones. The frantic, desperate anxiety that had plagued my entire childhood was entirely gone. I spent decades trying to bend myself into a shape that my parents would finally accept. I endured years of psychological abuse, hoping that if I just worked hard enough, they would eventually treat me with basic human decency. I allowed them to convince me that sharing genetic material meant I was permanently obligated to endure their cruelty. I know better now. I learned the hardest, most vital lesson a person can ever learn. Family is absolutely not defined by blood. Blood is just a biological accident. True family is defined entirely by respect, loyalty, and how people treat you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them. The people who abandoned me at my lowest point proved they were never my family. They were merely toxic passengers weighing down my life. I also learned that financial independence is the ultimate impenetrable shield against abuse. Money does not just buy luxury high-rises or private security teams. It buys you the absolute freedom to say no. It buys you the power to walk away from toxic environments without looking back. When you build your own wealth, you completely strip manipulative people of their leverage. They can no longer use a roof over your head or food on your table as a weapon to force your submission. You become legally, physically, and emotionally untouchable. I set my coffee mug down on the small glass table beside me and looked up at the stars cutting through the city lights. I had survived their betrayal. I had quietly built my own massive success in the shadows. When they tried to destroy me, I unleashed the full devastating force of reality upon them. I did not have to shout or beg. I simply let their own unchecked greed consume them. If you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, if you are constantly being made to feel like you are not enough, I need you to hear this. Stop trying to earn the love of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Stop breaking yourself into pieces to keep abusive people comfortable. Focus every ounce of your energy on your own growth, your own skills, and your own financial freedom. Walk away from the table where respect is no longer being served. The best revenge is building an empire so high they cannot even reach you to beg. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your future? How did you find the courage to finally walk away and build your own life? Share your stories of survival and success in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power and setting boundaries. Thank you for listening, and remember that your potential is absolutely limitless the moment you decide to put yourself first. The harrowing journey of Claire teaches us a profound and often painful truth. Sharing DNA with someone does not automatically entitle them to a place in your life. The most vital lesson extracted from her experience is that financial and emotional independence is the absolute ultimate shield against toxic relationships. For too long, society has pushed the rigid narrative that family is everything, forcing individuals to endure psychological abuse, manipulation, and utter disrespect under the guise of blind familial loyalty. Claire's story violently shatters this dangerous illusion. When she was perceived as weak and impoverished, her brother and sister-in-law discarded her like trash in the freezing rain, completely devoid of empathy. They only attempted to invoke the sacred word family when they discovered she possessed the immense wealth and power they desperately needed to save themselves from ruin. This stark contrast highlights a universal red flag: toxic people do not actually value you. They only value the leverage and resources they can extract from you. By quietly building her own empire and securing her financial freedom in the shadows, Claire stripped her abusers of their only weapon. Financial independence gave her the unassailable power to walk away, to say no, and to refuse to be a victim of her family's systemic gaslighting. She realized that true family is not determined by a birth certificate. It is forged through mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and kindness shown when you have absolutely nothing to offer in return. Claire's triumph was not merely about exacting a cold revenge. It was about reclaiming her dignity, protecting her son, and breaking a generational cycle of abuse. If you are carrying the weight of unearned guilt from a manipulative environment, take the first step today to build your own independence and permanently walk away from the table where respect is no longer served.